Hi there, folks. This is Jay Frost speaking to you. And of course, this is Frontlines of Social Good, but it's a little bit different today. This is our annual Horrors of Fundraising and Social Good show, and we are doing that on our Frontlines program because, of course, this deals with AFP ethics and ethics in our industry. So it's a perfect time to be talking about the news items, whether present or past, the stories that inform what we do and how well we do it, and maybe what we could do better. Once again, this is AFP Ethics Month, and so what does that mean? And how does that relate to the work that we do? Well, once again, today we're continuing a tradition that's become a favorite, at least for us, although sometimes feared by people in the field, and that is to share the real stories that I've collected over the years, some of which are funny, some a little scary, and a couple genuinely tragic. And we use these stories to revisit what organizations, donors, and fundraisers should and should not do, guided by the AFP Code of Ethical Standards and APRA's Statement of Ethics. Two different ethics statements, which I think will be very helpful to you in your work. If you're not already looking at them or having them pinned up on your wall, this is a good time to revisit them and perhaps to have them ready and handy, not just for this session, but for every day of the work that we do, not just Ethics Month, but every month. So I'm going to jump into a little history first. Some of these scandals are old, but the lessons don't age. Some are new, and maybe we haven't learned the lessons yet. One thing is always true, for better or worse, and often, unfortunately, for worse, we are very good at putting monsters in our rearview mirror and then forgetting all about them. So one of the questions I might ask, and if you're here with us live, feel free to answer that in the chat, is when you think of scary charity stories, what do you think of? Or maybe who comes to mind? So as you're mulling that over, I want to go ahead and suggest some of the people that perhaps could come to mind if we had a longevity in our thinking about philanthropy and the dangers to it. Father Bruce Redder, Covenant House. He was celebrated for supporting homeless youth, but internal investigations later found extensive misconduct and misuse of funds. Bill Aramone, United Way of America. He was convicted in 1995 of fraud and conspiracy after misusing charitable funds. John Bennett Jr., the Foundation for New Era Philanthropy. They ran a $135 million Ponzi scheme using new donations to pay earlier participants. Lorraine Hale of famed Hale House misused hundreds of thousands of dollars for personal luxuries, an example of governance breakdown. Roger Chapin of Help Hospitalized Veterans faced congressional scrutiny over low program spending and payments to associates. Larry Jones of Feed the Children, who was accused of no-bid contracts and kickbacks and was eventually dismissed by his own board. John Donald Cody, known as Bobby Thompson of the U.S. Navy Veterans Association, who ran a sham charity that raised tens of millions of dollars on false pretenses. Greg Mortensen of the Central Asia Institute, known for his book, 3 Cups of Tea, who settled with regulators and repaid funds used to promote his book instead of to fund his programs. As always, the pattern is familiar: weak oversight, concentrated power, leading to trouble. These scandals, chronicled by Charity Watch, for example, show how even trusted leaders can exploit donor generosity. And they remind us that transparency, documentation, and accountability are essential to protect both mission and trust. Nonprofit scandals aren't always about a single monster in the closet or under the bed, though. Institutions often lose their collective moral compass. In the 1960s, the Sugar Research Foundation paid scientists to downplay the risk of sugar and shift blame to fat. You can read all about that back in the New York Times in 2016. After the 2010 earthquake in Haiti, the Red Cross raised nearly $500 million, but later investigations revealed only 6 permanent homes were built. That's according to ProPublica back in 2015. Between 2007 and 2010, Sierra Club, another really prized charity, accepted over $26 million from natural gas companies before reversing course when the environmental cost of fracking became clear. That was covered in the New Yorker back in 2012. Until 2015, the National Football League, believe it or not, held nonprofit status despite multi-million-dollar executive pay And after public outcry, it finally relinquished that privilege. That was documented by CNBC back in 2015. Also in that same year, the Boy Scouts of America faced lawsuits alleging decades of sexual abuse, highlighting the importance of safeguarding youth within the programs of youth organizations. The Wounded Warrior Project came under fire back in 2016 for lavish executive perks and benefits, and not the least of which was spending only 60% on programs, something that has been a focal point of many discussions about overhead and whether or not that was justified or not. I leave it to you to decide. That same year, scrutiny over the Clinton Foundation, again in 2016, raised concerns about perceived pay-to-play access during Hillary Clinton's campaign. That was covered by CNN in 2016. I'm giving you these citations in part so that you can look up these stories if you wish and find out what you think is the most salient points of these stories, how to avoid either the conflicts or the appearance of conflicts or impropriety that then dogged these organizations or individuals. But also to make the point that this is not just a single person's opinion, but rather it's extensively covered and researched by the press. So even if the stories may not sound very familiar to us now, just less than a decade later, it is possible that that's because of blind spots we have in our own profession. And so revisiting these things occasionally is a healthy thing to do to ensure that we don't run afoul of either public perception, press perception, or our own donors' concerns in the future. There are two big stories that we'll talk about in detail in a moment, including the Trump Foundation and a certain individual whose name keeps coming up in the press, even though he is now deceased. And in each of those cases, as well as many of those we've already talked about, we look at everything from research manipulation to donor deception. They all reveal a sobering truth that without rigorous oversight and accountability, even trusted leaders and beloved institutions can misuse, by sins of omission or commission, the public's generosity. Let's look at a couple modern monsters. Those scandals of the past I mentioned might seem distant, even though they really aren't that distant in time, but their echoes are alive in our headlines right now. I'll talk about a couple things from 2025 to begin. Feeding Our Future, Minnesota. As reported in the New York Times and the Associated Press, juries convicted multiple defendants in one of the largest nonprofit fraud cases in U.S. history in just the last year. Hundreds of millions of dollars meant to feed children during the pandemic were diverted to luxury cars, homes, and jewelry. Prosecutors detailed elaborate shell organizations, fabricated invoices, and even an attempted jury bribe. Key figures have received decades-long sentences, while Minnesota's Attorney General continues efforts to dissolve implicated organizations. The Detroit River Conservancy. In April 2025, the beloved Detroit nonprofit was rocked by the conviction of its former CFO, who embezzled more than $40 million over several years. Federal investigators found falsified invoices and forged checks, and the Department of Justice ordered over $45 million in restitution, prompting a total board overhaul and a renewed focus on internal controls. Then, of course, the National Rifle Association verdict. In February of 2024, again, just last year, a jury found former NRA CEO Wayne LaPierre guilty of violating fiduciary duties, spending millions of member dollars on private jets, luxury travel, and yacht vacations. And later that year, a judge barred LaPierre from any paid NRA role for 10 years and ordered millions repaid. The case being a stark reminder that even powerful institutions can be held accountable. A company that's known to many of us, Blackbaud, encountered its own data breach. After a 2020 ransomware attack compromised donor data across thousands of nonprofits, Blackbaud was fined $49.5 million in a multi-state attorney general settlement in 2023, 3 years later, and an additional SEC penalty for misleading disclosures. The case reshaped expectations for cybersecurity and transparency in the philanthropic technology sector. So even as we've confronted data breaches and financial fraud, another more insidious kind of corruption has eroded public trust, the way money and privilege buy access, even after wrongdoing. The next two stories, which I alluded to before and which I'm sure you'll be familiar with at some level, reveal how worlds of power and philanthropy can blur dangerously when influence outweighs integrity. The first is the Donald J. Trump Foundation, which was established in 1988 and ostensibly devoted to charitable giving, which later became a case study in what might be described and has been described in the press as self-dealing and political manipulation. Investigations by the Washington Post, which earned a Pulitzer Prize, and the New York Times, and the New York State Attorney General's office revealed that the foundation frequently diverted charitable donations to serve Trump's personal and political interests. Among the documented abuses were payments used to settle lawsuits against Trump's businesses, the purchase of a 6-foot portrait of himself for display at one of his resorts, and the improper use of funds to support his 2016 presidential campaign. That's according to NPR, the New York Times, both respectively in 2016 and 2018. The foundation also misrepresented the origin of the donations, taking credit for gifts funded by other donors, and made only minimal contributions to legitimate causes, according to the press coverage. In December of 2018, under a court-supervised agreement, the foundation was dissolved. And in 2019, in November, a New York State Supreme Court judge ordered Trump to pay $2 million in restitution for, quote, illegally using the foundation for political purposes, end quote. And the remaining funds were distributed to a set of bona fide charities, according to the New York State Attorney General's office. The court's findings, supported by documentation and assigned admission, confirmed repeated violations of state and federal law governing nonprofit conduct. Another name that I know is familiar to you, but not necessarily in the philanthropic context, is Jeffrey Epstein. Jeffrey Epstein cultivated extensive financial and personal relationships with many institutions through philanthropy as well as his other dealings over the years. And Harvard and MIT specifically were institutions which were recipients of his generosity. Even after his 2008 conviction for sex crimes, including at both Harvard and MIT. This is according to coverage in the New York Times, Miami Herald, E-Jewish Philanthropy, and the Nonprofit Quarterly. At Harvard, Epstein donated nearly $9.2 million between 1998 and 2007, which of course predates his conviction, his earlier conviction, including a $6.5 million gift in 2003 to establish the Program for Evolutionary Dynamics, or PED. Despite his criminal record, he maintained close ties with the program's director. A 2020 internal review revealed that Epstein visited Harvard's PED offices more than 40 times between 2010 and 2018, often accompanied by what were described as young women, who were then in turn described as assistants. He was even provided an office, dubbed Jeffrey's office, and a card granting him unrestricted access, according to the New York Times. Epstein had also been appointed a visiting fellow in Harvard's psychology department in 2005. Again, that does predate his conviction, despite lacking academic credentials, a decision later criticized as emblematic of privilege over principle. Following the university's 2020 review, Harvard pledged to donate the remaining $200,000 of Epstein-linked funds to organizations supporting victims of sexual violence. The Program for Evolutionary Dynamics was later shut down, and the director of that program was sanctioned for policy violations related to his relationship with Epstein. At MIT, Epstein's influence ran through the Media Lab. Between 2002 and 2017, he made at least 10 donations, totaling $850,000, most of them funneled anonymously through foundations to obscure their origin. Much of this funding came from after his conviction, and was directed to projects overseen by the Media Lab director. Both the Media Lab director and a professor there maintained close relationships with Epstein, professional relationships, and continued accepting his money and facilitated his visits to campus as late as 2017, according to Wired Magazine and MIT News. The director of the Media Lab ultimately resigned in 2019, following a New Yorker expose revealing his repeated acceptance of Epstein's funds. In 2020, MIT's fact-finding report concluded that administrators made, quote, significant errors in judgment, end quote, by continuing to accept Epstein's donations after 2008, damaging the institution's reputation, even though no specific policies had been violated at the time. The scandal triggered a global reckoning in academia about the ethics of accepting what might be described as dirty or tainted money, particularly when the donor's crimes contradict institutional values. The Epstein and Trump cases do reveal that these kinds of ethical lapses in philanthropy are not confined to obscure organizations or administrative negligence. They reach sometimes into the highest circles of power and influence, including in philanthropy, where wealth, ego, and influence do collide occasionally with public trust. From those high-profile collapses to ongoing sector-wide challenges, 2025 brought more sobering headlines. You may remember Captain Tom, the older gentleman, the retired vet who walked his garden, raising money for charity. Well, the Captain Tom Foundation, named for him, following a Charity Commission inquiry in 2024, the family trustees of the Captain Tom Foundation were permanently disqualified for serious mismanagement and conflicts of interest. And the foundation, established in honor of the late centenarian fundraiser, Captain Sir Tom Moore, was found to have directed funds toward family-controlled companies rather than charitable causes. What about the Maui wildfires? I'm sure you've heard about those, you've seen the images, and maybe you made contributions in support of the communities there. Well, in February 2025, the Hawaii Supreme Court approved a $4.04 billion global settlement between state and county governments, utilities, and insurers following the devastating Maui wildfires. The case highlighted post-disaster accountability and the need for transparent fund distribution when philanthropic and public dollars mix. In just the last few days, there's been a lot of discussion, especially in forums like LinkedIn among professional fundraisers, about GoFundMe and other service providers to the sector. Early in 2025, GoFundMe, the fundraising platform, faced industry backlash after it was discovered that the company had created more than 1.4 million of what they describe as nonprofit pages without the organization's consent, using scraped IRS data and routing gifts through a PayPal giving fund. This is all the description of how the fund was originally set up. Following outcry from sector leaders, the company apologized, adopted an opt-in model, and de-indexed unclaimed pages to ensure that the SEO was not benefiting GoFundMe and that the organizations owned both their own ability to raise funds, their own brand distinction, and of course their own SEO or search engine optimization benefits. There's more on that topic that's occurring every single day. And in fact, in the last few days, some have asked about other entities that have giving baskets. For example, Charity Navigator, which has an embedded donation system, which has been criticized by some for slow disbursements, up to 60 days in some cases, and unclear donor data handling. A gift made on the first of the month, for example, according to some, might not reach the nonprofit until near the end of the following month. This raises questions about financial float, donor ownership, and the ethics of convenience in online giving. So in 2025, ethics isn't just how we ask, it's also how we handle the money, who owns the donor relationship, and whether technology platforms respect the trust at the heart of giving. Now, from those stories, many of them very contemporary and fresh in the news, some maybe coming across your table in just the last few days, to stories that we've heard over the years, they all help us to understand how there's a practical context for the rules or the guidelines provided by our major associations, especially the Association of Fundraising Professionals and APRA, and their ethical policies and processes. And if you're a member of AFP, you are signed on to that ethical code of conduct. If you're a member of APRA, similarly, you are almost by definition as a member observant of APRA's code of ethics. So how do those apply in real life? Well, sometimes either by design or by accident, we find ourselves running at least skirting the lines of those ethical codes of conduct. And I have accumulated stories over the past 20 years, some of which are quite old but still very relevant. Others are a little newer, that help to paint a true portrait of how these things can occur and hopefully give us some guidance as to what to avoid. So I'll share some of those with you now. And I'll start with stories that talk about accuracy. Accuracy is a very important characteristic across all of fundraising. We want to be sure to be accurate in everything we do. It's particularly relevant, of course, for the research shop or gift acceptance policies, things of that nature, whether it's just to ensure that we have the right name in the database or are acknowledging the person properly when we send a gift acknowledgement or even putting a plaque on the wall. There are lots of reasons why we want to be accurate. Well, here are a few good cautionary tales to guide us in making sure that we are accurate in what we do. This one I might call Howling Good Time, and it dates back to 1985. These are first-person accounts, by the way. I fielded a phone call from the president's secretary who had just finished talking with the wife of a new trustee. The trustee's wife called regarding invitations to events and that they were receiving from the president's office. She expressed an interest in attending events, but had to ask if the university was really serious about extending the invitation to the trustee and to his spouse, Molly, the family's German Shepherd. Her entire family wanted to be there for the first black tie event that Molly attended. What happened was that the DoD, the Director of Development, had lunch with the new trustee and then informed research staff that the name of the family's dog was the trustee's spouse. According to the person writing the story, we had a lot of fun with this Freudian slip in the office. Research staff accepted the information from the DoD without doing any fact-checking. When I fielded the call, I was just about finished editing the new trustee directory, which included the names of spouses and one dog named Molly. Imagine the fallout from a horror story of this nature. Fortunately, the family had a great sense of humor. Several years later, they named a chair in honor of Molly and in memory of the secretary of the Board of Trustees, who was not very pleased with the situation back in 1985. Here's another one called Life on the Farm. My boss approached me one day to tell me one of our governors had read a research report in which I wrote about a prospect's sexual activities. Dumbfounded, I said there was no way I would ever write about something like that. I immediately went to my research file to see what I had written. On my report, which was about a retired couple, I wrote that they enjoyed loving on their farm. Of course, I meant to type, enjoyed living on their farm. You can imagine my red face. Needless to say, I reported back to my boss that it was a lack of proofing rather than a lack of judgment, and it makes for a good story in any case. Here's one called You, Your Wife, and Your Other Wife. A place I used to work at was set to deliver a named endowment proposal to a major donor. The major gifts officer gave the information to staff to prepare the document and a mock plaque. Unfortunately, neither the major gift officer nor the staff double-checked the names, going off the major gift officer's personal address file, and the information was old. The proposal had the major donor's former wife's name, and they had just ended a messy divorce. The good news was that the proposal was delivered in person, not to the former wife's house, and the major donor calmly pointed out the error and agreed to the endowment, with a name change to the current wife. Of course, the gift basket that was sent to thank them for agreeing also, you guessed it, had the former wife's name on it. Do what a good carpenter does. That might be a good guide for all of us in this world of accuracy, which is to measure twice and cut once. And when it comes to proofreading, proof twice before publishing. This is one from AFP from 2023, a story which might be described as booking pledges without written confirmation. And it comes from some of the stories that AFP does share each year during Ethics Month. Another practitioner described an organization that routinely booked pledges without written confirmation, sometimes relying on secondhand texts or emails from volunteer fundraisers to claim commitments. The respondent noted that a former CEO had encouraged this behavior to boost metrics before board meetings, and although the CEO had departed, the culture lingered. The AFP Code of Ethical Standards helped to identify this practice as unethical, violating standards 1, 2, 4, 6, and 20. I'm not going to repeat all those to you. Look them up. The staff eventually changed their procedures, though the respondent wished they'd felt safe to speak up sooner. The moral: booking without documentation isn't optimism, it's risk disguised as progress. And I would add one more moral to that story, that if people don't feel safe to speak up, then we need to develop a culture where ethics is, of course, in a primary position, and people feel it is their duty to defend the organization and its donors by speaking clearly. It's not condemning an organization or people, it's making sure we're doing the right thing. Let me jump on to another category, which is really important, and that is relevance. And once again, some of this ties very closely with the world of research as a subcategory within development or fundraising, but a very important one, because sometimes information that is collected throughout an organization ends up in the hands or the files of the people who manage our data, whether that's called research or prospect development or what have you. It's very important that they have information which is relevant, and then the information that is produced and handed to others is also relevant, that the irrelevant is not recorded and it's not there for decades. Here's one called Blackout Tales. I'm still blacking out comments made in files by a former vice president who would write notes in the margins of call reports, calling donors things that are unprofessional and rude. Contact report entries included things like this. Quote, Jane confided in me that she is having her will rewritten now to eliminate her niece and nephew. Another one said, she explained that their two sons do not get along, so her will says that if they cannot divide the estate equitably between them, the entire estate will be left to University X. Here's another. Alan said Tim should not be contacted as he is not well. Charlie added that he was corrupted by all the money, did not handle the stress well of playing second fiddle to his brother, and is paranoid, and they think he lives in Monaco. And yet another. I relayed a personal story to her about my father's remarriage at the age of 82 when he was in poor health, and commented that at least she didn't have a situation like that. That's also another warning that people don't have to get that personal in developing a relationship between an individual and a donor. Here's another one that you might call, that doesn't look like me. And I'll leave out the name of the university here. When X University attempted to honor donors, I better leave out the names too, by installing gargoyle sculptures in their likeness, the tribute didn't go as planned. The donors, who had given $5.5 million for a new dorm, this was a few years ago, found the caricature-like statues described as resembling, quote, stone bobblehead dolls, both embarrassing, and they requested their removal. Known for their modesty, the couple felt that the exaggerated figures didn't align with their preference for subtle recognition. That's a story from Associated Press back in 2002. If you really want to know who the donors are, you can check it out there. How about responsibility? Having the responsibility to do what we do and do it well is important, and knowing what our responsibilities are and making sure that everybody understands one another's responsibilities is also equally important. Within that category of responsibility is knowing about our boundaries, and this first story really cuts to the heart of that. You might call it no boundaries. We hired an assistant who unfortunately had no ability to understand boundaries between right and wrong. After researching an alumnus who she was not supposed to be working on, and who at one time was going to leave us property but then changed his mind, she, again the staff member, had lunch with him and tried to persuade him to change his will so another organization would not receive his estate by default. Then she decided she was the best person to run his estate and was going to suggest that he hire her to do this. She was fired after this and other incidents, including letting student workers read trustee files so they'd, quote, know all about them. The lesson, job descriptions matter, but ethics training matters more. Here's another one that you might describe as, can you help me with my book? And this gets to the heart of what we saw before with the media. The media can be our friend. I'm hopefully being your friend right now by sharing these stories with you too. But the media is also an arbiter of what they can learn and what they can share with the public that they think is in the public's interest. So how we work with the media is important to discuss and have a policy on and to observe, especially if they try to flout the rules in developing a story. So here's that story. Historically, University X closes early on Fridays in the summer at 12:30 p.m. Around 12:45, the front doorbell rang. Only a handful of staff remained, including the prospect researcher. This is not unusual, folks, who answered the door to find a man claiming to be writing a book on the life of Denis Kozlovsky and requesting to review his gift records to the university. The AVP of Public Relations happened to still be in the building and was asked to speak with the man. When the researcher deferred, the AVP turned to her and said, "So tell me, what is our policy on releasing donor information?" Luckily, the author left with a few alumni magazines, but no donor records. And the following week, the Wall Street Journal ran a front-page feature on University X's connection with Denis Kozlovsky. It turned out the visitor was working for the Wall Street Journal. The moral: every employee, from top to bottom, must know the privacy policy and follow it. Here's one called "Just the Facts, Ma'am." The director of development traveled to Texas for a national board meeting and asked her assistant to fax a donor profile to the hotel. The cover sheet got separated, and the faxed profile was delivered directly to the donor himself. I'm going to take a little sidebar here to say that I would be surprised if anybody has a fax machine anymore, since it's the 21st century. But we all have an email account, and we all forward things really fast, sometimes without thinking. So if you think this doesn't apply to you, think again. Anyway, the cover sheet got separated, the fax profile was delivered directly to the donor himself. And fortunately, most of the information was public, but the giving history was not. The donor confronted the director at the event saying, "What is this?" It required some smoothing over. The takeaway: never fax confidential materials, or never forward them by email, text, or any other means. How much do you guys make? Another story. A researcher once posted on a professional listserv, those do exist right now, AFP has one, APRA has one, there are many of them, once posted on a professional listserv asking for salary ranges for corporate attorneys at large companies. At the time, this company was Sears, which used to be an enormous company. The next day, they got a call from the top corporate attorney at Sears asking why someone wanted to know what their lawyers earned. The researcher was mortified, and they learned a simple lesson. Never post identifiable details on public forums you never know who's reading. That doesn't mean we aren't open about what we do and forthright about it and honest about it, but it does mean we should be aware that what we do can be seen by the public, so we should do it in a way that is appropriate and responsible. This is one from AFP from 2023, and again from their Ethics Month stories, and it might be described as sexual harassment from a prospect. So why is it in this category? It's hard to know where to place something which, by some measures, is so pervasive. But I would say responsibility is perhaps a good place to think about this, since when we see it and we recognize it, we probably need to report it. Not just if it's happening to us, but if it's happening to colleagues. How you do that probably has to be in conformance with your policy, but we should have a policy and we should know what to do. It shouldn't be a mystery. So, sexual harassment from a prospect. An employee confided to her supervisor that she was being harassed by a potential donor. She wanted to keep managing the relationship, so her supervisor offered to take over and credit her for the eventual gift if she preferred. She declined and later left the organization. The supervisor reflected later that he should have intervened directly, telling the donor that his behavior was unacceptable, a realization that came with the Me Too movement. The lesson: our ethical duty extends to protecting colleagues, not just donors. And another one from AFP that might be described as scholarships not following donor intent. At a community college foundation, a staff member discovered that scholarship funds from a local community foundation were not being applied according to donor intent. When she asked questions, leadership became evasive, and the bookkeeper broke down in tears. She sought outside advice and was told to call the DA or quit. She chose to resign rather than cause public harm to the college, believing new leadership would fix the issue, and eventually it did. She later said she wished there had been an AFP ethics ombudsman to consult. Conflict of interest is another category which is really important to us in our field, and I'll just jump into that right now. This is a story that might be called "Take My Clients, Please." While at University X, one of our key volunteers, a partner at Goldman Sachs, gave me a large binder of all Goldman Sachs clients and their assets. It was a goldmine of information, but also a breach of confidentiality. I handed it back immediately. Here's another one. Might be described as sharing the wealth. A trustee on the nominating committee of University X gave the university's confidential binder of potential trustees to another organization where he also served on the board. What we have in our heads may not be like what we have in a binder, but again, the organization and the relationships it has are sacrosanct. Policy should govern these kinds of exchanges and probably, in almost all cases, forbid them. Another one might be called, we're all part of the same institution, aren't we? Again, another first-person story. I work for an arts organization on a university campus. We in the university share many of the same board members. One board member, who does a lot of fundraising for us, took the profiles I prepared on her prospects and gave them to university administrators, who promptly called those individuals to verify the information and told them where it came from. We had a, quote, come to Jesus meeting with our volunteer solicitors after that. Never assume they know that profiles are confidential, even if there's a huge reminder at the top, which, by the way, in an age of digital, may not be there. So policies are important, both to write, to apply, and for all to understand. And never forget that we must protect donor privacy from friendly colleagues inside our own institutions. This is one from AFP from 2023 that might be described as donation in exchange for admission. Now, we don't always in the development world or in the advancement world have control over this, but it's certainly something we can be aware of and discuss. So I'm bringing this up in this category for that reason. A university advancement officer met with a parent who promised a six-figure gift if their child were admitted. The officer conferred with senior leadership, and together they informed the parent that no gift would be accepted during the admission process or while the student was enrolled. The child was eventually admitted, graduated, and the family gave a gift years later. The officer said the AFP Code of Ethical Standards had guided the conversation and reaffirmed that integrity protects both the institution and the donor. And just a note for myself, as we saw in this story, it does not mean that you won't get the support one day. In fact, it may confirm for the prospective donors that yours is an institution that is ethical in its processes, and that's another reason for them to have trust in the institution and therefore to be willing to support it at a significant level as the relationship develops. These might be described as uncategorizable, and they are certainly hair-raising. They're all about fundraising practices, and I think we've all seen variants of this in our offices. Here's a couple of them. Just a few final pledges is the first one. My predecessor was asked to produce letters of intent for a $2.5 million campaign he was completing. He did, and then resigned 2 weeks later. When I arrived as interim director, I discovered that many pledges were fictitious. One lead donor had never heard of the campaign. Another was furious that her late husband's employer gift had been double counted. Out of the supposed 2.5 million, less than 1 million was real. The facility had already been built and dedicated. We ended up covering the gap with debt service, and it took years to rebuild credibility, and we're still paying off the lesson. Here's another one that I call remembering the really important donors. If you have an annual fund where people make phone calls, perhaps you have a way for people to know and celebrate when a gift is made. That's what this story is about. During the phone-a-thon season, a freshman caller proudly told an alumnus that every time they received a pledge, they rang a bell. "But you should have been here last week," he said. "It was noisier then. We were calling all our really important donors." Here's one that you might describe as red-headed executives. And to understand this, think about the photographs that we sometimes have of donors or even just people out in the wild. Sometimes they're in color, sometimes they're in black and white, especially if it's in print. Let's say it's an old alumni book or something of that nature. Late one afternoon, the president's office called with an urgent request. Identify a retired executive from a major corporation who, quote, might have red hair. That was all the information provided. This is what the researcher did. I combed through all the old black and white annual reports, guessing who might be the redhead, and by some miracle, my hunch was right, but it reminded me that even in high-stakes research, sometimes rests on the thinnest of threads. Don't look now. A former colleague working for a charity in Massachusetts once visited the campaign chair's home for a one-on-one planning meeting. She told him she might be outside. He arrived, knocked, but there was no answer. So he walked around the back, as he was directed to do, and found her sitting by the pool. He took a seat beside her, as he was instructed to do, and began their discussion, making sure to keep focused on his paperwork and in concentrating on the conversation. She was completely naked. He spent the next hour heroically maintaining eye contact or paper contact while talking campaign strategy. True story. There's also this whole category of confidentiality, and this has developed a lot over the years, and we think we have good policies on it. I won't give you too much on this, but I will give you one story about the worst possible scenario when you are inevitably shredding something. Because even in a digital age, sometimes we have documents that must be shredded. So here's a couple of shredder stories. An organization once suffered a major breach when documents awaiting shredding fell off a truck on the freeway. A reporter found them and published an expose showing that donor and client records, including, in this case in the past, social security numbers, were among the debris. Another office learned the same lesson when clear plastic garbage bags full of donor files were discovered on the curb. Others found that recycled paper on a windy day became a confetti of confidential information across campus. Nothing leaves the building unshredded anymore. Here's another one called the Not So Anonymous Donor. Our organization received an anonymous bequest. The president, eager to share the good news, sent an all-staff email and got the donor's name wrong. Once again, a colleague connected him privately, and another reminded him the gift was anonymous. Nevertheless, he then, at a campus coffee, made an announcement and announced the name, and again in a newsletter, mailed it to 30,000 people, all still with the wrong name. Now, this one is a little more serious, but it's to stress that these things really do happen, and we have to be careful with our data. I don't imagine that this kind of thing can happen much anymore. But unless we have good, strong policies and we observe them and everybody's taught to observe them, it's not impossible that this kind of thing could happen today. And I might call this the stalker. Again, true story. At the start of term, amid registration chaos, a young man came to the window claiming to have an urgent family message for a student. He knew her social security number, and that was taken as proof of identity. The staff member confirmed the student's enrollment and handed him a printout containing her schedule, address, and phone number. The next day, the student was found murdered. The man was her abusive former boyfriend. She had changed schools, names, and records. Everything was ex-directory. The staffer was dismissed. The institution overhauled its privacy policies. But for her, it was too late. So that's just a few readings from the collection of stories, some funny, some terrible, that I've collected over the years. You probably have stories of your own. I would encourage you to share those with one another as you think about these policies in our offices and what they mean. They all circle back really to one central truth, which is that ethics is not a rule book. It's really a daily practice. It's the small, unseen decisions that protect or erode the public's trust, or our trust in one another, or our trust with our donors. And trust is how philanthropy proceeds. Philanthropy moves at the speed of trust. When a fundraiser ignores documentation, when a leader chooses reputation over reality, when a researcher sends one fax or an email too quickly, when a platform profits off of donor data. Each of these moments, intentional or not, chips away at the foundation on which philanthropy rests. And in some cases, those cracks can become disasters. Think of, again, Feeding Our Future, where one false invoice became thousands, or Harvard and MIT, where a donor's power blinded the institutions to their own values and policies and procedures, or, of course, the Trump Foundation, which turned generosity into personal currency for a time. And think, too, of the quieter errors, the trustee list that included a dog, the fax that found its way to a donor, the scholarship that never reached the right student. Any of these kinds of things are things that we can help to avoid, again, through our policies, our internal training, and making sure that those are really guardrails that have a third rail quality, so we don't land on them in our efforts to not just to raise money and to maintain relationships. People appreciate it when we honor those safety rails. So I want to encourage you all to take a look at the AFP and the APRA Code of Ethics as you move on through the end of this fun and sometimes scary month, and consider how you might apply them in your office, first by reading them, keeping them handy, discussing them, seeing how they relate to your own policies and procedures, how there is training performed on that on a fairly regular basis in the same way that you do now to ensure that there is no hacking of your institution, that kind of thing. And encourage you to then revisit these stories every year so that we can have a chance to share them with one another, have a little fun, but also know that we're acting in the best interest of our institutions, our donors, and all those we serve. Thank you for watching and for sharing and for keeping a light on this work. We look forward to seeing you this Thursday for one of our regular CFRE accredited sessions, and that is in fact on a related topic, but it's not about fear. It's about asking without fear. We have coming to us Mark Pittman, who's the author of Ask Without Fear, among other books. He's going to be talking to us how you can do exactly that, and you can pick up your CFRE credit to do it. That's on Thursday at 1 p.m. Eastern Time on our How to Raise show, and you can also check out our podcast. We just dropped our latest episode, a great discussion you're going to enjoy. That's wherever you like to listen to podcasts, as well as on the DonorSearch website, this website of our sponsor now for 10 years, under the resources tab, or on their YouTube channel. We'll look forward to your hearing those and telling us what you think, as well as what you think we should be covering in future episodes of these 3 series. So until next time, take care and do good.